France has just removed every ounce of gold it had stored at the Federal Reserve. All 129 tons of it. Gone. And the explanation it offered may be one of the most revealing central bank statements made in decades. Not because it was truthful, but because of how openly unconvincing it was. At the very same time, gold, after reaching record highs above $5,500 an ounce, suddenly collapsed by 20% in just a few weeks. It marked the worst weekly drop since 1983. And this happened during an active war in the Middle East, during an oil shock, in exactly the kind of environment where every market model, every finance textbook, and decades of historical precedent say gold should be rising, not falling. Those two developments are not separate. They are two visible symptoms of one deeper story. And that story is about who really controls the price of gold, how that control works, why the market was pushed in this direction at this exact moment, and what the institutions that actually understand this market are doing right now, while most investors are focused on the wrong things. Everything I'm about to show you is sitting in public view. Exchange filings, central bank disclosures, vault inventory data, capital flow reports, delivery records. The reason most people never piece it together is not because the information is hidden. It is because the evidence is scattered across different reports, different institutions, and different headlines, with nobody connecting it into one coherent picture. That is what we are going to do now. The gold market operates in two completely different layers, and most investors make the mistake of treating them as if they are the same thing. That confusion is one of the costliest mistakes you can make in this market. The first layer is the paper market. That means COMEX in New York, the futures exchange where financial contracts tied to gold are traded around the clock by hedge funds, banks, and algorithmic systems. Each contract represents 100 ounces of gold. This is the market that creates the gold price you see quoted everywhere. And here is the critical point, the one that changes everything. Roughly 95% of COMEX contracts never end with real physical gold being delivered. They are paper claims. The total notional value of those claims is far larger than the actual amount of physical gold available for delivery. This is not some hidden conspiracy. It is simply the structure of the modern pricing system. The second layer is the physical market. That includes London's LBMA vaults, the Shanghai Gold Exchange, and direct central bank movements. It is less liquid, less visible, and discussed far less often. But this is where the true long-term signal exists. Now look at what happened after the Iran conflict erupted. The CME Group changed margin requirements from a fixed dollar amount to a percentage of contract value. That sounds technical, but the effect was enormous. It meant that as the price of gold rose, margin requirements would automatically rise with it. In other words, the system itself became a built-in amplifier. Then, within 2 weeks, those margin requirements were increased 3 separate times. That created a brutal asymmetry. Institutions like JP Morgan, Goldman Sachs, and HSBC, firms with effectively unlimited access to capital, could absorb those hikes without any real problem. Smaller hedge funds and retail futures traders could not. For them, it became existential. They either had to post more collateral immediately or start selling, so they sold. That selling pushed prices lower. Lower prices triggered fresh margin calls on other leveraged positions. That forced even more selling. Prices dropped further. More margin calls hit. More liquidation followed. What you got was a self-reinforcing liquidation spiral. A purely mechanical cascade that had nothing to do with gold's underlying fundamental value. Now ask the most obvious question. Who benefits from that? The institutions with deep balance sheets, the ones that could sit through the storm, got to buy what weaker players were forced to dump at distressed prices. This is one of the oldest transfer mechanisms in institutional finance. The exchange will describe it as a routine response to volatility. And technically, that description is not false. But the outcome was entirely predictable from the structure of the decision. Small players were flushed out, large players accumulated. That was the first force pressing gold lower. But 3 other forces arrived at the same time. The first of those was Turkey. Turkey imports around 90% of its oil. When the Middle East conflict pushed oil above $110 a barrel, Turkey's energy bill exploded by billions almost overnight. The lira was already weak. The country's reserve cushion was already thin. That left Turkey facing a brutally simple choice: either protect the currency or keep the gold. Turkey chose the currency. It sold somewhere between 60 and 120 tons of gold in a matter of weeks. To understand the scale of that, consider this. Total global gold ETF outflows during the same period were around 43 tons. Turkey alone sold more than the entire ETF outflow that most of the financial media was blaming for the decline in price. The second force came from the Gulf states. Their problem was different in structure but identical in effect. The Gulf monarchies maintain dollar pegs. To defend those pegs, they need dollar reserves. Normally, those reserves are replenished by oil export revenues. But when shipping through the Strait of Hormuz was disrupted by conflict, oil revenues slowed while the obligation to defend the peg remained in place. That gap had to be covered somehow, and one of the most liquid reserve assets they could sell quickly was gold. The withdrawals recorded from LBMA vaults in London matched both the timing and the scale of what large sovereign selling from the Gulf would look like. The third force was the US dollar, and this is where things become counterintuitive. In an acute geopolitical shock, the normal gold-dollar relationship can invert. When fear hits suddenly and hard, global capital does not just run into gold. It also floods into US treasuries. That demand strengthens the dollar. And because gold is priced in dollars, a stronger dollar mechanically makes gold more expensive for non-US buyers, which suppresses demand and pressures price. The chain reaction worked like this. Conflict pushes oil higher. Higher oil lifts inflation expectations. The Federal Reserve cannot cut rates in the middle of an inflationary surge. Higher US rates attract global capital. That strengthens the dollar, and a stronger dollar pressures gold. Then institutional algorithms, programmed to sell when real yields rise, begin executing at scale. The system feeds on itself. Now we get to the fourth force, the one that makes the broader strategic picture impossible to ignore. France had 129 tons of gold sitting at the Federal Reserve, gold that had been there since 1920. Between July 2025 and January 2026, all of it was removed. The official explanation from the Banque de France was that the gold in New York was old, non-standard, and no longer compliant with current market specifications. So, according to the official story, France sold that gold in New York, then bought compliant gold in Europe, and now stores all of it in Paris. That explanation falls apart the moment you test it. Every serious gold repatriation before this, Germany's program from 2013 to 2017, the Netherlands, Austria, was done by physically transporting bars. Standard transfer, standard shipment, no strange detour through sale and repurchase. That is how countries bring their own gold home. Selling your gold in one place and buying replacement gold somewhere else is not how repatriation normally works. That is how you behave when you have a claim on gold, but cannot actually get the specific bars delivered. You only take that route for one of two reasons. Either logistics make physical transfer impossible, which they do not in a case like this, or the gold being claimed cannot actually be delivered. Now, let me be careful here. This is an interpretation, not a proven fact. The interpretation is that France asked for repatriation, discovered that physical delivery could not be completed, accepted a cash settlement instead, and then agreed with the Federal Reserve on a cover story that framed the whole thing as a technical compliance upgrade rather than a failed delivery. Both sides would have every reason to agree to that. The Fed would never want to admit a delivery problem. France would never want to admit that the security of its gold holdings may have been compromised. That part is interpretation. What is not interpretation is what happened immediately afterward. Prominent German economists and lawmakers began publicly calling for Germany to repatriate its own gold from the United States. A former Bundesbank economist said openly that storing gold in America now carries geopolitical risk. Germany still holds roughly 400 tons at the Federal Reserve. That debate is no longer theoretical, it is active. And this echoes something deeply important from history. In 1965, Charles de Gaulle sent a French warship to New York to exchange dollars for gold under Bretton Woods. Other nations followed. The gold drain intensified. By August 1971, Nixon shut the gold window unilaterally. That was the Nixon shock. That was the end of Bretton Woods. That was the beginning of the dollar reserve system that has dominated global finance for the last half-century. I am not saying history will repeat in exactly the same way. But the deeper pattern, foreign governments losing confidence in the United States as custodian of their gold, is not structurally different. And neither are the potential consequences. Now look at what was happening underneath the surface while the paper gold market was collapsing. COMEX registered inventory, meaning gold actually available for delivery, fell by roughly 25% during the same period that paper prices were falling. Think about what that means. Physical gold was leaving the system faster and faster at the exact moment paper prices were under the greatest pressure. Real metal was disappearing. Paper claims were being dumped. Those are not the same thing. Physical gold does not vanish because a futures trader gets liquidated. The bar remains real. The contract does not. And then there was China. Something happened there that received almost no meaningful coverage in Western financial media, yet I believe it is one of the most important developments in the gold market in the last 10 years. Chinese financial regulators authorized 10 major insurance companies, including PICC and China Life, to allocate up to 1% of their total assets into gold. That 1% may sound small. It is not. These are institutions managing trillions of renminbi. The estimated potential demand from that program alone is around $27 billion US. Only about half of the companies involved have even started deploying capital. The sector is nowhere near the maximum allowed under the program. And if the pilot expands to more institutions, which the regulatory framework explicitly allows for, the scale becomes much larger from there. At the same time, Chinese gold ETF inflows stayed strong even while North American ETFs were bleeding outflows. The premium on the Shanghai market over COMEX paper prices remained elevated. The message from China's physical market was clear. As prices fell, Eastern institutional buyers were stepping in aggressively. That is the real asymmetry defining this moment. In the West, leveraged paper holders facing margin calls were being forced to sell. In the East, unleveraged institutions with long time horizons were buying physical metal into weakness. The price that Western investors were panicking over was, from the perspective of Chinese insurers and Asian central banks, simply a discount window. There is a name for this in market structure analysis: transfer from weak hands to strong hands. Weak hands hold leveraged positions and can be forced out. Strong hands hold outright ownership, view declines as opportunities, and have the balance sheet and patience to wait. What we just watched was a large-scale transfer of that kind, mechanically engineered. The engineering mechanism was margin policy. The beneficiaries were the players who either influenced or were strong enough to survive that environment. Now step back and look at the larger system, because individual events only make sense when you understand the structure that produces them. In February 2022, the United States froze around $300 billion in Russian central bank reserves. Whether that decision was justified is a separate debate, but one consequence was unmistakable. Every sovereign wealth fund and central bank in the world saw that dollar-based reserves are not untouchable. They are not neutral. They are not guaranteed. Their accessibility depends on your political relationship with Washington. That realization changed the way nations think. Countries like Poland, Kazakhstan, Brazil, India, and China, all of which have been buying gold at the fastest pace in decades, are not doing that because they ran a spreadsheet and concluded gold might go up. They watched what happened to Russia and drew a straightforward conclusion. If your national reserves are held inside a system controlled by a possible geopolitical rival, then those reserves are not fully under your control. Physical gold sitting in your own vault with no external counterparty and no foreign gatekeeper is the only reserve asset that cannot be frozen, blocked, or seized by someone else's foreign policy. That is what de-dollarization really is. Not ideology, not anti-American emotion, not symbolism. It is rational sovereign risk management in response to a demonstrated precedent. Now come the second-order consequences, because the daily price action is not the real story. COMEX delivery inventory is shrinking. Physical demand from Eastern buyers and sovereign accumulators is rising. The number of leveraged Western paper holders who can still be margin called into dumping their positions is finite, and every liquidation cycle reduces that pool further. At some point, the paper market's ability to keep price detached from physical reality reaches its structural limit, and when that limit is reached, the snapback will not be slow, it will be sharp. The Federal Reserve is now trapped between two pressures. Inflation remains too strong for easy rate cuts, but economic weakness increasingly demands them. At the same time, the arithmetic of $38 trillion in government debt, with huge portions of it rolling over at current rates, creates a fiscal burden that cannot be comfortably sustained forever. Eventually, something has to give. That likely means lower real rates, more monetary accommodation, and a weaker dollar. And that is the macro environment in which the long-term bullish case for gold fully reasserts itself. Now here is the real psychological test for investors. Yes, gold fell 20% from its peak. That is real. And for anyone holding it, that is painful. But ask the question that actually matters. Did the U.S. fiscal deficit improve? Did central banks stop accumulating gold? Did the physical market suddenly show oversupply? Did de-dollarization reverse? No. None of those things changed. What changed was that a leveraged paper market suffered a mechanical event, amplified by sovereign forced selling caused by an energy shock, all moving through a temporary dollar-strengthening channel. That is not the same as a broken thesis. The structural case did not weaken. If anything, the system simply created more time for strong hands to accumulate at better prices. The people positioned to benefit from the eventual convergence between paper pricing and physical reality are not the investors staring at the daily COMEX quote and reacting emotionally. They are the ones who understand the difference between a mechanical event in the paper layer and a true deterioration in the underlying long-term thesis, and they have the discipline not to confuse the two. So watch the signals that actually matter. Watch vault inventory, watch physical demand. Watch sovereign accumulation flows. Watch the divergence between paper claims and physical movement. Do not confuse those signals with the daily noise of a leveraged futures market that, by design, is not a perfect reflection of the asset it claims to price. France brings its gold to Paris. China authorizes its insurance giants to build what could become the largest gold allocation program in the country's history. Central banks across the non-Western world continue buying more than 1,000 tons a year. The CME changes margin rules in a way that flushes out leveraged retail and smaller participants while allowing the most capitalized institutions to accumulate distressed supply. These are not isolated events. They are not random. They are the visible actions of institutions and states that understand something profound. The global monetary order is in the early phase of a transition away from unipolar dollar dominance and toward a more distributed reserve system in which physical gold plays a more central role than at any time since 1971. Will that transition finish in 5 years? In 20? Nobody can say. But what can be said is this: the forces driving it are not fading, they are intensifying. The paper market is fighting a delaying battle against a physical reality that is becoming harder and harder to suppress. The strategy is real, it is visible. and it is being carried out right now at precisely the price levels that paper market suppression has made possible.